March 24th, 1944. Just after 10:30 at night, Stalag Luft III, a prisoner-of-war camp near Sagan, Germany, built by the Luftwaffe specifically to hold captured Allied airmen, on ground its designers believed made escape essentially impossible. Sandy soil that collapsed easily, seismograph microphones buried around the perimeter to detect tunneling, guard towers and dog patrols circling constantly, and barracks deliberately raised off the ground so guards could see beneath them and rule out any tunnel entrance hidden underfloor. The camp held thousands of RAF and Allied airmen, many of them experienced officers who had already tried and failed to escape other facilities before arriving here, and the Germans had built Stalag Luft III specifically to be the place where those escape attempts finally stopped. For over a year, a prisoner escape committee had been working against every one of those precautions, digging 3 separate tunnels codenamed Tom, Dick, and Harry, so that if the Germans discovered one, the effort could continue through the others. The scale of the operation was enormous for a project built entirely by hand, in secret, under constant threat of discovery. Hundreds of prisoners eventually involved in some capacity, whether digging, forging documents, tailoring civilian clothes from scraps of uniform and blanket material, or simply standing watch to warn of approaching guards. Tom was discovered by the Germans in September of 1943. Dick was abandoned as a tunnel and repurposed instead as a storage space for the sand excavated from digging Harry, which the escape committee needed to hide somewhere the guards would never think to search. By the night of March 24th, Harry was finished, 30 feet deep, over 300 feet long, running from beneath a hut inside the camp to a tree line just past the outer fence. The man who had organized the entire effort was Squadron Leader Roger Bushell, a South African-born RAF officer known to the other prisoners simply as Big X. Bushell had already escaped German custody twice before being recaptured, and each time he'd been warned, in increasingly direct terms, what would happen if he tried again. He built the tunnel anyway, on a scale designed to put as many men on the run as possible. Organizers had hoped as many as 200 could get out through Harry in a single night, a number large enough, they believed, to overwhelm German search resources and give at least a meaningful fraction a genuine chance at reaching neutral territory or Allied lines. What actually happened on the night itself was more modest and more chaotic than the plan called for. The tunnel came up short of the tree line, forcing escapers to crawl the final stretch of open ground in full view of a guard tower, rather than emerging safely under cover as intended. An air raid blackout complicated the exit process further, and the operation ran far behind schedule in the bitter cold, each man taking longer than planned to navigate the narrow shaft and emerge into the freezing night air outside the wire. Rather than the 200 organizers had hoped for, only a fraction of that number managed to get through before the operation was discovered. By the time a guard finally spotted movement near the tunnel exit shortly before dawn, 76 men had made it out into the German countryside, wearing improvised civilian clothes and carrying forged papers months in the making, scattering in different directions toward train stations, forests, and roads leading toward whatever border each man judged gave him the best chance. Only 3 of those 76 ever reached genuine freedom. Norwegian pilots Per Bergsland and Jens Muller made it all the way to neutral Sweden. Dutch Flight Lieutenant Bram van der Stok, after a journey stretching through the Netherlands, Belgium, France, and Spain, reached British territory at Gibraltar months later. The other 73 were caught within days, picked up at train stations, at checkpoints, in villages far from the camp, as an alarm involving 50,000 German searchers spread across the entire region. Adolf Hitler's reaction, when informed of the scale of the breakout, was immediate and disproportionate to what had actually happened. No one had been harmed in the escape itself, only embarrassed a German security system that was supposed to be airtight. Hitler initially demanded that every recaptured officer be shot outright. Senior officials talked him down from executing all 73, but what he settled for instead was still a war crime on a scale that shocked even some of the men ordered to carry it out. A list of 50 names was drawn up by Gestapo official Arthur Northeast by East and Reich Security Main Office Administrator Hans Merten, and Heinrich Himmler issued the order. The 50 selected men were to be handed over to the Gestapo rather than returned to normal prisoner-of-war custody and killed. If you want to hear the stories that show you exactly what men were willing to risk for freedom and exactly what it cost some of them, subscribe. We find these accounts, We verify them, and we tell them exactly as they happened. What followed was carried out with the same bureaucratic precision the Germans had applied to hunting the escapers down in the first place. Recaptured officers were taken from civilian or military jails in small groups, sometimes alone, driven by Gestapo agents to remote wooded locations under the pretense of transfer to another facility. There was no ceremony to it, no formal announcement of a sentence, nothing that resembled even the appearance of due process the Geneva Convention was supposed to guarantee a recaptured prisoner of war. At some point during the journey, the driver would stop the vehicle and offer the prisoner a chance to step out and relieve himself, a small, almost considerate-seeming gesture that was in fact the precise, rehearsed moment the killing had been designed around. The men were shot the moment they did, most from behind at close range, before they had any opportunity to understand what was actually happening. Every execution squad filed a nearly identical report back to Berlin afterward. The prisoner had bolted for freedom during a rest stop and was shot attempting to escape. It was a lie repeated so many times, in so many nearly identical reports, filed by different squads operating in different regions with no obvious coordination on wording, that it became its own kind of confession. No group of separate, unconnected killers happens to describe the same made-up circumstances in the same language unless they were told exactly what to write beforehand, following instructions passed down from the same central authority that had ordered the killings in the first place. Roger Bushell, the man who had organized the entire escape, was among the 50. He and a French pilot named Bernard Schiedhauer were taken from custody near Saarbrücken on March 29th and driven into open country by two Gestapo agents, Emil Schultz and Walter Breithaupt. Bushell was told, like the others, that he could step out to relieve himself. He was shot in the back as he did. His body, like most of the 50, was cremated soon afterward, the ashes intended to eliminate any physical evidence of exactly how and when he had died. Whatever the Gestapo hoped to accomplish by destroying the remains, it wasn't enough to erase the paper trail of reports, orders, and internal communications that a Reich bureaucracy obsessed with documentation had already generated at every step of the killings. Word of what had happened reached the camp itself first, delivered bluntly by the German commandant to the senior British officers still held there. And from the camp it moved through the Swiss protecting power channels responsible for relaying prisoner of war information back to London. When the full scale of it became known, 50 Royal Air Force officers, most of them experienced pilots whose skills and training represented years of investment, executed on Hitler's direct order for the crime of trying to escape a legal prisoner of war camp. The British government responded with public outrage and a formal vow that those responsible would be identified and tried once the war ended, whatever it took and however long the investigation had to run. That investigation began almost as soon as the war in Europe was over, led by Wing Commander Wilfred Bowes and, most prominently, Squadron Leader Frank McKenna of the RAF's Special Investigation Branch. A case that would become the only major war crime of the entire conflict investigated and pursued by a single branch of one nation's military, rather than a joint international tribunal effort from the outset. McKenna approached the case the way one historian later described him: dogged, methodical, unwilling to let the trail go cold even when it ran through 4 different occupation zones controlled by 4 different Allied powers with 4 different sets of priorities, at a moment when the emerging tensions of the post-war order were already starting to complicate cooperation between former allies. The investigation stretched across more than 2 years, and it wasn't always straightforward. Many of the Gestapo agents involved in the killings had scattered into different occupation zones, some captured and held by American forces who were, according to the RAF's own case files, reluctant to hand suspects over until their intelligence value to the Americans themselves had been exhausted. A memo from April of 1946 noted plainly that certain SS officers wanted for the killings would only be released once their usefulness to their American captors had run its course. McKenna's team pressed anyway, tracing individual killers through Gestapo administrative records, cross-referencing which regional office had handled which recaptured officer, and matching the nearly identical execution reports against the specific men who'd signed them, building case files suspect by suspect across a bureaucracy that had, ironically, kept meticulous records of almost everything it did, including the murders it was simultaneously trying to disguise. By the time the investigation concluded, McKenna's team had identified 69 Germans connected to the killings across the various regional Gestapo offices responsible for different groups of the 50 victims. The trial opened on July 1, 1947, before the No. 1 War Crimes Court at the Curio House in Hamburg. 18 defendants stood in the dock, ranks ranging from senior Gestapo officials down to the drivers who had ferried prisoners to their deaths, all of them now facing testimony and documentary evidence built from more than 2 years of painstaking cross-referencing. Every one of them denied the charges, several arguing that they had simply been following orders passed down from Berlin, others claiming they had played only a minor logistical role and bore no personal responsibility for what happened once a prisoner stepped out of the vehicle they were driving. The prosecution laid out the killings location by location, matching the identical cover stories in the German paperwork against physical evidence, exhumed remains, and testimony from the handful of officers who had survived similar transport but avoided execution, building toward the same conclusion the court in the Malmedy case had reached a year earlier under similar circumstances. That a pattern this consistent, repeated by supposedly independent units across multiple regions, could only reflect centralized policy rather than a series of unconnected individual decisions. On September 3, 1947, the verdicts came down. Max Wieland, an Obersturmbannführer with the Breslau Gestapo, was convicted of conspiracy and sentenced to life imprisonment. Breithaupt and a Karlsruhe Gestapo official named Boschert received life sentences as well. 2 drivers, Dinkmann and Struve, received 10 years each for their role transporting victims to the execution sites, the tribunal judging that even a supporting role in a killing carried out with this degree of premeditation deserved serious punishment. Others were acquitted for lack of direct evidence connecting them to a specific killing, even where their broader involvement in the operation was clear, a reminder that even a meticulously built case couldn't close every gap left by 2 years of scattered suspects and incomplete records. The reckoning didn't end with the Hamburg verdicts. Separate proceedings followed for individual killers identified after the main trial concluded. Gestapo agents Johann Schneider, Emil Weil, and Eduard Geith, tied specifically to the murders of 2 escapers named Gauss and Stevens, were convicted and hanged at Hamelin Prison on February 27, 1948. By the time all the related proceedings concluded, 21 of the men McKenna's team had identified were ultimately executed for their role in the killings, a devastating final accounting for a crime that had begun with 50 men told, one at a time, that they were simply being allowed to step out of a car and stretch their legs. Of the 73 recaptured escapers, 23 were spared. 15 were returned to Stalag Luft III to finish out the war as ordinary prisoners once again, for were sent to concentration camps rather than executed outright. 3 were held separately by Gestapo headquarters in occupied Czechoslovakia. For reasons the post-war investigation was never fully able to establish, this smaller group avoided the fate of the 50, a distinction that seems to have depended less on any coherent policy than on which regional Gestapo office happened to receive them and how closely that office followed Himmler's original instructions. Most of the 50 men executed were cremated at the time of their deaths, in keeping with the deliberate effort to erase physical evidence of exactly what had happened to them. In the years after the war, Allied recovery teams worked to locate what remains could still be identified, tracing execution sites from the same reports the Gestapo had originally filed to disguise the killings. The same falsified paperwork that had once been designed to hide the truth eventually became one of the tools used to help recover what little physical evidence remained. Most were eventually consolidated and reburied together at the Poznan Old Garrison Cemetery in Poland, a permanent resting place for men whose killers had specifically tried to ensure no permanent resting place would exist at all. Per Bergsland and Jens Muller, the 2 Norwegians who made it to Sweden, both survived the war and returned home, going on to live full lives decades removed from the night they crawled through a tunnel into the German countryside. Bram van der Stock, who reached Gibraltar after months on the run through occupied Europe, lived into old age, one of the last living links to a night that had cost 50 of his fellow escapers their lives and had, ever since, come to stand for something larger than the tunnel it began in. The story of Stalag Luft III would go on to become one of the most widely told episodes of the entire war, adapted for film and told and retold for generations. But the version most audiences came to know rarely lingered on what happened after the escape itself, the 2 years of patient cross-continental investigative work it took to make sure the men who murdered 50 unarmed officers didn't simply vanish into the chaos of a defeated, occupied Germany the way their own falsified reports had. Once tried to make Roger Bushell and 49 other men disappear without a trace. If stories like this one matter to you, the ones that show what it actually took to bring wartime killers to justice, sometimes years and continents removed from the crime itself, subscribe and stay with us. We'll keep finding these accounts, verifying them, and telling them exactly as they happened.